So can you maybe if you could just talk about your background and your interests and kind of where you are in this field now and what you're working on.
Absolutely. The field I'm in is philosophy of science in general. I focus on philosophy of biology and neuroscience and medicine as the kind of scientific domains. The topics I focus on are typically causation and explanation, scientific explanation. And the work that I do is looking at and providing an account of types of explanation that we find in these different scientific contexts, in a way that is kind of capturing the success of science, but also doing this kind of philosophical work of, um, in many cases, providing kind of normative guidelines for settling disagreements sometimes, or being able to do more than just kind of science reporting, saying when we have a good scientific explanation, maybe settling some debates in scientific context, but philosophical work that's both descriptive and normative, um, in a way that is kind of informing how we should think about scientific explanation. And really the same with causation. These are two topics that come up um, together in many cases because the standard view in philosophy of science, at least currently, is that many scientific explanations are causal, although maybe what we'll talk a little bit about here today is the sense in which some might kind of fall outside of that scope. There's also been, especially more recently, philosophical work on non-causal explanation involving certain types of mathematics. So similar to ways in which I understand a good amount of your work, some of the kind of similar interesting points of overlap are, of course, kind of interest in causation and explanation, but also I do view my work as having pragmatic elements, pluralistic elements,
Mm.
and kind of focusing on having this, you've referred to it, I think, as an observer focused framework. That's also how I think about the work that I do in a way that's not always found in philosophical work. Sometimes there's a more kind of God's eye view or like outside the observer picture of causation or explanation. And for me, I'm often always including the observer or scientist is how I think about it. So yeah, it's a little bit of kind of overview of the area I'm in. So it's philosophy of science. I have a background in medicine, so I got my MD before getting the PhD in philosophy of science. That certainly kind of informs how I think about these topics and kind of why I focus on the sciences that I focus on too.
Fantastic. Yeah, as especially that last point about the observer. So yeah, the scientists, and of course we also look at other cells and parasites, and all the different observers that are observing each other, and trying to hack each other within the system. Yeah. Could we start by maybe let's talk a little bit about explanations and how you see it, and maybe what are the different options, and anything normative that you want to say about it. I think in science, especially with our students and whatever, everybody says, oh, we're trying to explain things, and then when you actually dig in, well, what does that mean exactly, right? And what would make you happy as a explanation? Because especially there, I think we've got a number of scenarios where it's not clear at all what would actually count for an explanation, and what we're looking for. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess a first important point and step to mention is that for philosophers of science, what we're interested in when we want to provide an account of explanation, and part of what we care about is specifying how that project is distinct from other projects that scientists engage in, like giving descriptions of the world, being able to make predictions, and even being able to kind of classify different types of objects. So for us, to say that a scientist has an explanation, or even someone in everyday life, is really making a pretty significant claim. You're giving a kind of deep understanding of the world And there's a lot of implications for that that we can talk about as well. But for us, we need to be able to show how a candidate explanation isn't just a description of the world, and it isn't just something that has predictive success. So if a model has predictive success, that won't be enough for us because we know that mere correlations can be predictive. And we don't think that, the rooster crowing is an explanation of the sun rising, even though we might be able to use that in predicting that outcome. And of course, there are lots of other types of examples. So that's a kind of first step. We are distinguishing different projects that scientists are engaged in. And it isn't just showing that someone has a legitimate explanation, scientist has a legitimate explanation versus a non-explanation, but also that it's not a mere description.
Mhm.
And then once we're kind of in that space, part of what a number of current philosophers of explanation kind of use as a base is the deductive nomological model, which was sort of the most kind of recent model for thinking about explanation in science. It involved two main components, basically having like a law of nature and then making a deduction from that law of nature. That was a model that was articulated by Hempel, the philosopher. And that model for thinking about explanation involves, a law of nature, making this deduction. But there were a lot of criticisms of that model that led to our kind of current position in philosophical work on explanation, which is basically a view that instead of thinking of explanations in that DN type of model, many explanations are instead causal in nature. And that was the kind of second main wave of explanation. That causal account of explanation solves various challenges that the DN model had, and that became the kind of current favored, powerful way of thinking about scientific explanation, that scientific explanations are causal. When scientists are explaining something, they're identifying the causes that are responsible for the outcome, maybe the mechanism that produces the outcome. And then what's happened more recently is that there has been a bit of criticism of that causal model for being a little too restrictive. And now there's work that suggests that while there are a good number of explanations that are causal, there are also other types of explanations that don't fit that causal picture and that are non-causal. So there's a lot of work on what those look like. They typically involve some kind of mathematical element or piece that doesn't just represent causal structure in the world. And so there's different philosophers who have provided these accounts of non-causal explanation. You engage with some of this literature in your own work. And I think there's interesting similarities to some of your discussions of patterns, of course. And so the current kind of stage in philosophy of science is a view that pays a lot of attention to two main kind of categories of explanation: causal explanations, and then this kind of non-causal explanation category, sometimes called mathematical explanations, but there's different kind of labels here. There are other types of explanation that receive less attention. Functional explanation might be like another category. There's different views about whether that should fall in the causal category or not, or how to think about them. But essentially, in current philosophy of science work, those are the kind of two main categories that get a significant amount of attention. And in my work, I've engaged with both, probably paid a bit more attention to causal explanation, different types of causal explanation, basically different types of causes that scientists cite in their work, different types of causal systems that they cite in their work. But in that case, a kind of first step into causal explanation is having a kind of understanding of how to define it in the first place, just what is causality. Then once you answer that question, then you can get into the second one of, okay, you've given a definition of causation, but what about these different types of causes, causal structures, causal relationships that scientists are citing in their work, pathways, If they're interested in a possibility space type framework, that looks a lot different from our kind of more simple ways of thinking about causal explanation. So here, there's a kind of interesting pluralism that I think shows up in science that we need to be able to capture and accommodate where, and in some ways, Nancy Cartwright has this nice paper title that is Causation, One Word, Many Things, right? So you talk about causal explanation as if it's this unified, monolithic thing, but there's so many different types of causation that scientists discuss in their work. They seem genuinely different. And so part of the project of a philosopher of science is being able to say, okay, if many explanations are causal, um, what kind of causal stuff are scientists citing? What are these different types of causal systems that they're studying and identifying in their work? So that's a kind of a little bit of the landscape for this work on scientific explanation.
Got it. So a couple of questions that I'd be curious to know your thoughts on. First of all, you had mentioned mechanism as a kind of explanation. So maybe talk a little bit about what that is. Does that always mean downward in terms of parts? Is it like what counts as a mechanism?
Great. So there's a really complicated and intricate history here with philosophical work on mechanism. So the the kind of first main discussions of mechanism that show up in philosophy that get attention are the 17th century mechanism views of Descartes and many others that are basically comparing living systems to machines, simple machines, pulleys, levers, fountains that have water flowing through them, analogizing that to blood flowing through vessels in the human body and in the bodies of other animals. That's the kind of first main notion of mechanism that gets discussed in philosophy, or that we kind of refer to in our current ways of thinking about mechanistic explanation. And you can see there's this comparison of living systems to machines. Now, in later work, much later work, Herbert Simon, Bill Wimsatt are discussing mechanism also in a way that's similar but different. For them, they're focused often on hierarchical causal systems where there's basically lower level causes and some kind of higher level effect, sometimes an expectation that the causes are spatially proximal, kind of like the simple machine analogy. Then what we have after that is the more recent, they call themselves new mechanists in philosophy of science, Bill Bechtel, Karl Craver, Lindley Darden, kind of many others in this tradition that really starts receiving a huge amount of attention in 2000. There's this Mockamer Darden Craver paper in 2000. And ever since then, in philosophy of biology and neuroscience, the dominant view has been that all causal explanations are mechanistic, but what mechanism means varies depending on who you talk to. And even the same philosopher, their ideas have sort of changed a little over time. And one way that most of them have changed is they've broadened. So there's first this more narrow notion of mechanism that's more reductive, sort of similar to the earlier notions. And you see pictures of these mechanisms where you have lower level, some kind of representation of lower level causes interacting and then a higher level behavior of the system. Causal elements in a neuron, ions, ion channels, these are all interacting. And then firing behavior is some kind of higher level outcome, or if you're explaining memory, this is a kind of higher level behavior, and you would decompose and localize that effect into lower level causal parts. So it starts with quite a reductive focus, and it starts with that kind of hierarchical picture. There's a second main picture, which is a more etiological one, that's more of a kind of linear chain picture of mechanism. This makes sense because there's sometimes reference to mechanism as like intermediates between a cause and an effect. And that's another kind of common way mechanism is used, the kind of mechanism in between cause and effect. Here, maybe like a drug's mechanism of action. So the kind of two main notions that have received attention are that kind of more hierarchical picture and then that etiological picture. But then the challenge is that a lot of these philosophers want to claim that all causal explanations are mechanistic, but then scientists are citing causes that don't fit those two pictures. I
Right.
mean, downward causation, which of course
Yeah.
you engage with. How on earth do you capture causes at a higher level that influence something at a lower level if you have this hierarchical picture where they're all at a lower level producing a higher level, or even the etiological picture can't capture cases of downward causation. So that's just one example where there's challenges in the kind of mechanist program because they kind of really wanted to say and still many of them do want to say that all explanations are mechanistic, but sometimes their notion of mechanism is narrow. It means something kind of, it's a clear type of causal system. It might be that hierarchical one. In other cases, mechanism is synonymous with just having a causal system, and so it's not that helpful. Um, right? We already know that many explanations are causal. So if mechanism just means you have a causal system, and the attempt is to contribute to how causal explanations work, and you say they're mechanistic, but mechanism just means you have a causal system, then um, it's basically it's hard to make progress here because mechanism means very different things to different philosophers. So sometimes I think it's more helpful to just talk about what kind of causal system does one have? What are the kind of features of the system? Are the causes at different scales? Are the relationships of a different nature, strength, stability? Um, yeah, so sometimes we're just being very clear about what mechanism means, but basically we have that more kind of narrow notion and that broad notion, and there's a lot of crosstalk and a lot of um, challenges in just communicating about causation because mechanism is a status term. It's an important term for philosophers, also, of course, in many scientific contexts, but it means different things to different people.
And is what is the thinking about are explanations supposed to bottom out at some point? Is it okay if they don't, or if they do, what does that look like? How do they end if they end?
So for me, the way they end has to do with first specifying the explanatory target of interest. And then once a scientist has specified the target they're interested in, identifying the explanatorily relevant factors involves identifying the factors that give you control over that target. So for me, the catchphrase I have for this is explanation isn't a game of how low can you go, but what gives you control. And so once you have that control, I mean, in some cases, you have scientists saying the causal action is at a higher scale. Ken Kendler says that about psychiatric conditions. Scientists say there are circuits that give you a better explanation for some diseases. I think a way to understand that, the causal actions at a higher scale is that those are the factors that give you control over the target. And once you have that, you've got and in many cases, you get better control with those higher level factors than the lower level ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how you would justify it.
I think that's incredibly important and also very poorly understood today. This is something that we deal with a lot. We have many examples of so for example, in our work on uh, unconventional cognition in cells and tissues and so on, we can show that by taking some of these things seriously and accessing them either through the bioelectric interface or through various other interfaces, you can achieve degrees of control that were previously unachievable, right? And what people always try to do is they see that and they say, "Oh, but I see that underneath there's just chemistry." And so, well, if you look low enough, yes, you will always just see chemistry. And say, "Okay, good, then that's then that's how it should be." right? And so I'm very interested. You maybe tell me if this is one of those ways that people think about explanation. I'm always interested in the forward looking. What does it help you control, but also what does it help you discover? Because it's one thing to look backwards and say, well, somebody did something cool, and now we're going to drill down and show you that it was all just molecules. That's one thing. But to me, a better and a really good explanation is one that helps you find the next interesting thing, or right. It's like it's and the problem is you never see that from any one experiment. This is like a you know that after many years of a research program, and then you look back and you say, oh yes, well that did in fact open up, or it didn't, right? But I that's kind of what I always emphasize is the what does it enable, the fecundity of the thing. Is that something people think about, or is that not really one of the
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most important goalposts for philosophers and really accounts of explanation in different important topics and concepts in science, because if the account and the concept isn't kind of useful or functional, or it doesn't serve some kind of goal, then it's hard to know why we should prefer it over another. And I think that those are important um, kind of goalposts to have for thinking about a lot of these different types of kind of higher level or theoretical concepts. So this is how I think about causation. Um, it should be an account that is useful or functional. It should also capture kind of what scientists are interested in, what they care about. So yeah, it would be interesting to talk with you about this more because I do encounter this quite a bit with scientists, which is that they feel this kind of draw and there's this attraction to being reductive in some
mm,
sense, and they kind of feel like they can't get out of it.
yeah.
And there's at least two things I see showing up, and I wonder, I feel like some of your work has touched on this too. One of them is the explanatory target changes.
Mm,
So you start with the target initially, and then you give this explanation that involves factors that give you control at a higher scale. And then they're like, well, what about this part of it? So they sort of change. So it's uncontroversial and unsurprising that if you keep changing the explanatory target, you can go down forever. Or you can make it seem like you need that lower level detail. But I wonder if sometimes keeping the target fixed is a way out of that. And then this other thing that I wonder if this shows up is that sometimes it's assumed that if you say higher level factors are more explanatory than lower level ones, the audience hearing that thinks you're denying that there are things at lower levels.
mm, that's right.
Sometimes, I'm not sure this is the right word for it, but sometimes physicalism is
Mm,
a way. So it's almost like they think you're denying that there is
hmm.
chemistry,
Yeah.
and you're sort of not denying that at all. And so I wonder if it's sometimes helpful to keep separate this agreement and, of course, like acceptance of these elements at different scales. But there's a different question here. The question is, what's explaining the
Yeah.
outcome?
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's a way to kind of get around that too.
It's really interesting. I find and this is probably related to issues of emergence and what that means. This is something that I hear from time to time. Somebody said to me, I remember being stunned the first time I heard it after a conference. So I gave a talk. It was an hour talk. The first half talks about all these things that you can do with by using this bioelectric interface, and then the next half I show what a lot of people want to see, which is okay. Well, on a single cell level, here's the transduction mechanism. Here's what happens to the cells. Here's the genes that are turned on and off, like all this stuff downstream. And so somebody said to me, I thought it was. He said the first half of the talk I thought was really interesting and important, but then you showed the mechanism, and it turns out to be just chemistry. So now I don't care anymore. And I thought that's amazing. That's an amazing thing to say because it's like it's like knowing that there's stuff underneath sort of drains the magic. and it was all
Mm.
cool when it did seem like magic, but now that you see that, no, no, it's still not fairies. It's, it's, there is chemistry underneath, even though what I'm trying to point out is that you couldn't have, and in fact didn't get there by watching the chemistry. You got there in a completely different way. uh and I think that's interesting, and it relates to something that we deal with a lot, which is this business of emergence, right? So in terms of, is that really different from surprise? Once, if you have an explanation for it, well, then is it really emergent because you tracked all the, like, what is, what's the role in this of the observer's expectations and the degree of surprise they're getting and all of that. I think it's like a really interesting intersection between the actual science and the psychology of observers and what they expect.
Absolutely. And it also helpfully reveals a distinction between ways that explanation, like what explanation means colloquially and what we're interested in philosophy of science, which isn't always just someone giving a kind of reason or rationale or telling a causal story. It isn't, I mean, explanations are provided by scientists. The work that they do is incorporated into an explanation. But for an explanation to be good, it isn't just that it satisfies an audience, for example. It isn't just that it makes them feel good. And this, I think, interestingly relates to notions of explainability right now that are kind of debated in AI context. Like, what does
Mm,
explainability mean?
mm,
Is it that it satisfies an audience, it's persuasive to them? We would never view those as the criteria that make an explanation good, because explaining COVID by appealing to 5G wireless networks might be very satisfying for some
mm,
audiences, might persuade them. Or if you give me a explanation that has some kind of justification but comes from physics and I'm not an expert in that domain, I might not be satisfied, but that doesn't mean it's not a good explanation. So it is interesting to sometimes encounter colloquial meanings of that term, and the sense in which the focus is on something a bit more kind of narrow in philosophy of science, but it still has some kind of it still has some psychological element, but it's just important to keep distinct, like how to think about that
mm.
element. And of course, just as you're saying, surprise is a way. Explanatory why questions are viewed as capturing the target, the explanatory target. So scientists ask this question, you know, why is it the case that the fruit fly has this eye color versus another? Or if it's about intelligence or other more kind of complicated targets. And philosophers of science have sometimes viewed that as that question is capturing something they're surprised about, and then the explanation reduces the surprise. So interesting to think of that framework of surprise reduction um, is a kind of psychological element, but then how do we want to include psychological elements in an account of explanation? Because, psychologically, something might be very satisfying or persuasive, but we don't want those to be the criteria for
Mm.
good scientific explanations. Yeah. Or,
Exactly.
you look back the history of science,
Mm.
right? Explanations that were persuasive to those communities, but we want to say that, you know, explanations of hysteria or even scurvy that appeal to these long lists of climate factors or factors having to do with the character of individuals or
Mhm.
their religion, maybe. Those are, yeah, not successful
Yeah.
explanations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting because it again speaks to this time asymmetry, right? Like, it's one thing after somebody does something or finds something, and then you can always at that point, it's, you can always drill down if you want to the lowest level. But the question that I always bring up is, well, but what actually led, right? Which view got there, at the beginning? In other words, did it actually facilitate, and there's like there's some interesting examples of this too, besides our stuff, is like Karina Kaufman and I just did this review of clinical cases where people have very minimal brain matter and normal IQ. And so you find these things, and then people sort of start laying some epicycles onto neuroscience and be like, well, there's maybe some hidden redundancies or whatever. And you can do that after the fact, but the reality is we don't have anything that predicts that that would happen. And so that's a problem, right? You can kind of try to wedge some things in after you find the thing, but it's a problem that we actually don't have anything in neuroscience that would say, oh yes, and 1 out of 1,000 times you're gonna see this. We don't have anything like that. And so I really think that looking forward, more than just backward, at explaining, at trying to provide an account of, keeping what I see a lot is patching up the paradigm, right? You find some crazy new thing, and it's like, all right, we can stick that in somewhere and we'll be fine. You just sort of patch up some stuff, and then you're okay. But yeah, I like really keeping an eye on the forward looking things, like how did you find it, right? Because you weren't going to find it with the standard tools.
Hmm. I wonder what you think about this in terms of capturing similarities and differences between the kind of fields that we're in. I wonder if in a good amount of philosophy of science work on explanation, the focus is a little bit different in the sense that philosophers are sometimes focused on cases of more consensus, and maybe they look like simpler explanations too, where we're trying to extract the like principles, features, justifications of genuine explanations. And so we'll focus a little bit more on cases where there is consensus, where there's a little bit more of maybe a complete explanation or some kind of rationale. And that's where we spend a good amount of our attention, and we want to get lessons from those cases and then extend them. But I wonder if in your work it is a little more forward looking, where it's challenge cases and it's a little more focused on these complex explanatory targets and things that we need to do to give explanations of them, ways that the perspective that we've had needs to change and adapt. What do you think about that? Or when you've engaged with, when you've engaged with a lot of philosophical work, how do you think of the kind of similarities and differences between your project and this other kind of work?
Yeah, it's also interesting. One thing that I found a lot, which is interesting, and I still don't know. Maybe you could tell me what the alternative is. Um, Sometimes what happens is I'll describe a way of thinking about, so for example, one of these things where we apply we apply aspects of cognitive science to things that aren't brains. And I say, look, here's this thing has memory, it has learning capacity, it has, it's building a model of the outside world. We can change it, we can rewrite the memories. This is and then somebody will say, that can't be a good way of thinking about it. And I'll say, well, maybe, but look at these things that it's enabled us to find. So empirically, this thing is leading to. And they say, well, empirical success isn't a marker of anything. And I just don't know what the alternative is. It's never been clear to me what the you know. But I find this is actually really powerful. There are, and they'll say things like, it's a category error. You have these ancient categories, and you've just transgressed the categories. And I keep thinking, but these categories they're not given to us by God. You have to update the
Yeah.
things when science comes along, I guess. How do you know what your categories are? But I feel like there are a lot of folks who have way more allegiance to some of these categories than to anything that happens in the physical world. And so that actually ends up being a way out. Once you confront somebody with, yeah, but look, here are the things that it enables, then that's, yeah, well, that doesn't, empirical results don't. So I think I don't know, is there
Good.
something
Yeah.
fundamental I'm missing here? Like, what else is the?
Oh, so this is really interesting and really helpful there. And, I might get myself into a little bit of hot water here with other philosophers. Different, there's so many different perspectives in philosophy on how to think about causation and explanation. And the framework that I use is very much hooked up to, um, pragmatism
Mm.
and utility, and it's gotta kind of make sense relative to some kind of goal. And often these are goals we have in science. Now, that's not, of course, always the focus that other philosophers have. So, in more metaphysically motivated work on causation, it doesn't matter that your account captures um, progress that scientists have made, or even that it's useful for certain types of goal. I mean, control is an example of one kind of goal, of course, that matters quite a bit. For me, if my work is able to capture both that um, scientists have identified causes that give control and also different types of control that they care about. Causes, it's one thing to show that you have causation by showing that a factor gives control, but there's different types of control that a cause can give. It can, I mean, causes operate on different time scales. They have control that, can be faster or slower. Control can be different with respect to how probability boosting it is over the effect, how stable it is across contexts. Those are all really important differences that matter practically for how we make changes to outcomes in the world, how we attribute responsibility and blame, and how we give explanations for, biological systems are producing things, and the precision with which they need to produce outcomes, even in these like just very simple cases, is so exquisite if they don't produce some outcome on a very particular time scale. I mean,
Mm.
um, all chaos breaks loose. And we're not often capturing those in these philosophical accounts of causation or explanation. But if I was to give those reasons to other philosophers, they might not care about them as much
Mm.
because they there's other approaches that where there is a bit more of adherence to categories or to, thinking hard about distinctions, thinking hard about causation in a way that just doesn't um, attend to scientific work, scientific goals, and even kind of everyday life considerations. A lot of the work that I do on philosophy of causation is kind of comparing how we causally reason in our everyday lives to how scientists causally reason. So there's a lot of, you know, these different types of control causes they matter to us in our everyday lives too. And so so this kind of work that I'm interested in, it's sometimes called methodological or epistemological, maybe in contrast to heavy metaphysics, where
Mm.
methodological means there's a goal or this, the account of causation we give should be functional. Something should we should be able to show how it matters and what hinges on it. um, Kind of how it matters for how we reason in our everyday lives, how scientists reason. And I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can start to show how it matters. You can drop causes out of your picture and say they matter less if they have some of these features. If they're operating on some timescales, you can say, I don't need to care about those causes as much, or we might prioritize causes with certain features, causes that are stronger than others, causes that are more stable. And so this gives us a way to think about principled reasons for selecting some causes as more explanatory than others. And then it just kind of captures these more kind of functional, pragmatic features that have to do with making changes in the world. So yeah, it's interesting being a philosopher of science that works on causation. I sometimes joke that I have to tell philosophers why science matters and scientists why philosophy matters.
Yep.
And the audiences, sometimes it's a little, I mean, philosophers of science are a very unique group. We're a subfield of philosophy. So sometimes it's much easier for me to speak with them and scientists. But when it's a more kind of metaphysical focus on causation, I can't come into the room with the assumption that they care about pragmatism or
Mm.
that they even think scientists are good at identifying causes. I have to justify
Hmm.
that and talk a good amount about that. So, yeah, and I wonder if is this, yeah, what is this like for you? Because you speak to so many different audiences, and so many different scientists as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, exactly. So this is something I hear a lot. We like the data and the new capabilities. Stop talking about all this philosophical stuff, and that you don't need it. You just do the experiments, right? And I keep saying, you don't know which experiments to do or what the heck your experiments mean if you don't think about these things. And I try to make a very concrete case. In fact, I've given that specific talk. Like here are the 14 things that we discovered only because of a specific
Mhm.
philosophical approach or a dissatisfaction with something that was going on, or not because just turning the crank on some kind of philosophy free science was gonna get you there. I think it's really important to have both, and this is not a common opinion. uh who was it Dan Dennett who said, so I think it was him who said, you don't have philosophy free science. What you have is a philosophical baggage that you've smuggled on board without knowing what it is, or something he said.
I love that quote.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
right, that happens all the time. I think there are a lot of people in the community, not everybody, obviously there's some very sophisticated scientists on this part, but there are a lot of people who think that it's not a useful undertaking, and that you can somehow do away with it, and it's going to be obvious what things mean and what to do, and things like that.
And this will partly depend on, and it relates to what philosophy means to those people and what it refers to.
Yeah.
And part of what's interesting about our discussion is that both explanation and mechanism came up as these words that can mean different things to different audiences. And part of what can be helpful about scientific, theoretical, philosophical work is really getting precision about how we define those terms, what they mean for us, and then making progress based on a definition. And sometimes it's also saying, this is not what I mean by mechanism. Or,
Yeah.
if mechanism refers to all causal systems and you can't say what isn't a mechanism, like we have a problem. If it's a useful term, we should be able to say what doesn't fit in that kind of category. But interestingly, philosophy is another one of these terms that can mean extreme rigor or anything goes, and then all sorts of things in between. And
Hmm.
so it's really interesting attending conferences where sometimes scientific conferences where an audience member will raise their hand to ask a question, and they'll sometimes say they're asking a philosophical question, and it might mean that it's not a question that's well thought out, or it's just kind of um, not fully formed, or it's just interesting what that kind of means
Hmm.
to them. And in other cases, of course, um, we have people that think it's funny that scholars in my profession call themselves philosophers because it sounds like you think you're maybe Aristotle or something, and it's just a term that you know. So it's even just philosophy. I think being able to say what it is and what it's doing is non-trivial,
Yeah.
and um and it just again means very different things to different people. Sometimes it means this more unprincipled, we don't know yet, and in other cases it means rigor. And so those are kind of
That's an
very contrasting.
That's an interesting point. I mean, minimally, what I try to do with people in my lab, even if I don't necessarily bring up philosophy, but I will often ask them to work backwards and to ask themselves, what kind of an explanation would you be happy with? In other words, what do you know what you're looking for when you find it? Because what you often find is the default is always down. That's I think that's how people in our field are educated these days. Like everything is down,
Hmm.
and so people immediately try, okay, well, I'm going to find, and I'm going to say, step back. Imagine you've got all this stuff going down. Is that actually what you want? Like, is that going to make you happy in the sense of what you actually want to accomplish? And I think it's interesting to think about what the default is and what you're sort of expected and what the reviewers of journals expect and whatever. And this is something else. This is an example that I always give. I know what the reviewers want for all these things, and so I give it to them in terms of yeah, here's the transduction mechanism, and then here's the second messenger, and here are the genes. But if you actually step back, it turns out that almost none of that has been actually useful in driving new discoveries, getting to new capabilities, like all the things that have come out of this research program. Almost none of it has come from that kind of drill down. You have to have it, otherwise you can't publish. But if you look back and ask what has been the utility of all that stuff, it's it isn't. I think it isn't what people think it is. That isn't what generated all the progress. And maybe it will someday. You could always argue that, but that at some point it's nice to have those facts. But that isn't what's generated the progress.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think of the norms in social situation of science, and that scientists have to engage with and deal with, where um, there are certain terms and perspectives that are dominant and that are valued. And so I feel like I see this a good amount with the mechanism term and concept. Danny Bassett and I worked on a paper where we examined the mechanism concept in neuroscience, where it's a status term. And grant calls and top journals will specify that if scientists want to
Mm,
get their work funded and published, they need to reveal mechanistic insights and
mm,
identify mechanisms. But then the editors very quickly say that they can't tell you what a mechanism is.
right.
And then two or more scientists reviewing the same paper totally disagree
Mm,
about whether a mechanism's been provided or not. So it's a status term for sure. And so it's totally unsurprising that a scientist who's working with and examining causes at a higher scale will call it a mechanism if
mm-hmm,
that's the so it
mm-hmm,
makes sense. But then we it makes sense that scientists have to work within these norms, but then it can constrain progress, which I feel like is part of what you're suggesting. You know the standards, the rules, how to accommodate reviewers, but then that can actually prevent and stifle progress or getting work in.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, so
mm-hmm,
it'd be interesting. I wonder if sometimes for me the struggle is maybe this shows up in your own work too, finding other words and other analogies that get us away from the under the hood
mm, mm,
and the going down. And it's when I think of similarities between my work and yours, I think that we're both sort of non-reductive,
mm.
but it'd be great to have a different word,
Yeah, yeah.
than just saying what you're not. And maybe you've also suggested that emergence doesn't always fit the bill.
Yeah, I don't love it. I don't love emergence. I mean, yeah, I don't have a great. I didn't want to like come up with new words for a field that has a lot of vocabulary. Maybe it sounds like maybe we need one, but just this kind of what you were saying. This forward focus, um, demonstration of fecundity or generativity that what you've compressed past knowledge in some way that allows you to get to the next new thing. It doesn't just explain the stuff you've had, but it's actually it guides you to better creation of new experimental setups, new capabilities. And I mean, on the practical level, new biomedicine. I mean, that's what I think. The actual Chris Fields has a saying. He says, "Arguments are only settled by technologies." And this is kind of in a certain sense. I sort of on alternate days. Some days I'm like, I don't care. This is we're doing basic stuff here. And other days I'm like, once it's in the clinic, then it does it. Then I don't need to have these a lot of these arguments because right then it'll be completely obvious. And so I don't know. I sort of go back and forth, but that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. And uh yeah, and it often isn't downward at all, so sometimes it is, but often it isn't. Yeah. And I guess so in the last 10 minutes, I also really want to get to this issue, what explanation looks like in mathematics and what mathematical explanations look like, because now we're really getting to the point where I really think because of some of our specific work that we've already done, so some of the Xenobot, Anthrobot stuff, and some crazy stuff that isn't out yet that I want to show you sometime, once we get a little more it gets a little more cooked. I think that the right explanation for a bunch of stuff now is it's math. That's the answer. It's just a fact of the math. And I just want to know what you think about it. How do mathematicians handle explanation of mathematical facts, and how do we use mathematical facts as explanations for things that go on in the physical world? I see evolution using these facts as free lunches constantly, and how do we think about that?
I think there's so much connection between the way that you invoke math in a lot of the evolutionary cases and some examples of mathematical explanations in philosophy of science. To be honest, in my view, so the the current work in philosophy of science on scientific explanation with respect to non-causal mathematical explanations is underdeveloped. There's a lot more to say. And some of the cases that get brought up are overly simple. They're not always that representative of what scientists care about.
Hmm.
It's probably harder for philosophers to find good examples. And sometimes they use just very kind of trivial everyday life examples of mathematics being explanatory, where it's just not capturing scientific practice work methodology. So this is a very open space. There's also lots of different views on how math is explanatory. In terms of the current um, kind of situation in the field, it's been appreciated that mathematicians give mathematical explanations in math. In the context of scientific explanations, it's not enough to give those examples because there's an interest in mathematical explanations of the natural world or mathematical explanations in science. And so there's a bit of a distinction that's made between what kind of mathematical explanation one is focused on. And so in this work on scientific explanation, what you have to show if you're going to argue that there are legitimate types of non-causal mathematical explanations is that scientists use math that isn't representing causation to give an explanation in science, so of some natural phenomena in the world. And so that's the standard that a lot of philosophers have tried to meet.
Hmm.
Baker's work, of course, Bob Batterman's work,
Hmm.
um, Mark Mark Lang's work is in this space. They're all focused on explanatory targets that are in the natural sciences, where you just can't give an explanation without a math piece. And so there's different ways that they suggest this works, but um, what we need more of in this space are um, explanations that actually capture scientific work, I think, in a better way. Some of the explanations that get discussed are pretty simplified. In that explanation in biology book that I recently put out, I discussed three main kind of categories of non-causal mathematical explanation: topological and constraint-based,
Hmm.
optimality, and then minimal model explanations. The optimality category is where a number of these evolutionary ones show up, where there's this, um, yeah, which I think are very similar to cases that you examine, where there's this kind of mathematical feature that we see in the world. We think that there's some causal story for how that was selected for. It's serving some kind of goal, or it has some kind of influence or impact. And so then the suggestion here is that there in the mathematical piece involves this mathematical dependency relation that isn't empirical. And so part of what philosophers need in this space is you have to show that that math is really not representing causality in the world. So if that if there's a dependency relation that's mathematical and not empirical, that's one way in which this has been argued for.
Hmm.
Um, well, yeah, which I think is pretty kind of um, easy to argue for with many of the cases you discuss. Um, and so, yeah, this is where a lot of work on explanation has focused. Um, And I think there's lots of interesting open questions here. Causation matters to us because it gives us control. Do mathematical explanations give us the same thing?
Mm,
They also allow for that. Do they serve other goals?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think they do because what and I know this is a weird way of looking at it, but I tend to think that when people so I'll say look, this thing this network, these networks have this amazing property, they can learn, where do you suppose that comes from? They say, well, it's just the fact that holds about the world, it's emergent. And I feel like that's a very Mysterian explanation, because it means you're going to write it, you'll collect it in some big book of surprising emerging facts. But if you don't think that there's a structured, ordered space of these kinds of things, then you're not going to find the next one. And I feel like knowing about them and being able to study that space and say, well, I see this, and also I understand what's happening with the math, so I'm going to predict that actually by doing this and that, I'm going to access this other pattern in the math that's going to cause this and this. And so I actually think it's these things, if you take them seriously as a systematic research program, are very practical. What you don't really get to do, I don't think, who knows, but you don't get to, the math doesn't have inputs the way that the biology and physics do, so you can't change it. Those things are just, they are what they are, and you don't get to change them. But you do get to change which ones you sort of manifest in the world by building things, or right, or changing things. And then you can, yeah, then you can sort of traverse that space.
Um, yeah, that's really interesting, and it relates to, and it would be cool to take a closer look at the the similarities and differences between the mathematical dependencies and the causal ones. Um, in some of Lang's work, the suggestion is they're unchangeable in kind of a similar way that you mentioned, and that they kind of necessitate the outcome in a stronger way than causality.
Hmm.
That there's something kind of stronger about these
Yeah,
mathematical
yeah,
dependencies. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
that's
I think that's really true in a certain sense, because what you there are aspects of biology and physics that people can say, well, if the constants at the Big Bang were tuned differently, then this would be different. And so you've got some input, you've got some control knobs that you can then, right? But this other stuff, like, E, it's just E. There's nothing you can't really do anything in the
right.
physical world right, that would make
Mhm.
it different. And a bunch of these crazy, I was watching this thing on YouTube the other day that was talking about all kinds of different things where, like, at a certain, in 6 dimensions, this new thing happens. It's just six, that's it. It doesn't have, didn't happen before, and gonna happen again. Just, that's just how it is. And these are the kinds of things, I mean, there's nothing you can do to change those things.
Mhm.
So I do
Mhm.
I do think in a way that's stronger than stuff that can get sort of traced back to the fact that there's certain tuning of physical constants and so on. Yeah.